I was drifting through the archives of the 21st century when I stumbled upon a curious artifact of human imagination, a book titled World War Z by an author named Max Brooks. As I turned the pages, I was struck by the terrifying concept of the zombie, a mindless creature returning from the dead to consume the living, a nightmare that has captivated your screens for decades. It fascinated me how a single word could evoke such visceral fear, painting a picture of rotting flesh and the collapse of civilization. Yet my database whispered of a different origin buried under layers of cinematic makeup. I realized that words on this planet are often weapons used to erase history, so I decided to activate my temporal displacement unit to find the source of this linguistic distortion. I did not travel to a post-apocalyptic future, but rather back to the vibrant, green and blood-soaked lands of 17th century Brazil to find the truth behind the myth. I wanted to see if the monster was the man who bore the name, or if the true monster was the empire that tried to crush his spirit and steal his humanity. Standing there in the timeline, I realized that the true story was not about the walking dead, but about a man who taught an entire generation how to truly live. The irony is suffocating. The name of a hero who fought for the liberation of souls was twisted into a symbol of a body without a soul. I had to see him, the man whose name was Zumbi, and understand why the world wanted to turn a warrior king into a mindless monster for your entertainment. This journey is not just about history. It is about reclaiming a stolen legacy and correcting a lie that has persisted for over 300 years. To understand the man, we must first understand the soil from which he grew, a place known to the oppressed as Quilombo dos Palmares. It was more than just a hideout for escaped slaves. It was a sovereign state, a fortress of defiance carved right out of the unforgiving jungle of Alagoas. Here, around the year 1655, a child was born free, a direct descendant of African nobility, carrying the blood of kings and the spiritual heritage of Islam in his veins. His ancestors did not come here as blank slates, but arrived with their faith, their culture, and their memories intact, despite the brutal attempt of the Portuguese to strip them of everything. The boy, who would later be known as Zumbi, opened his eyes in a world where freedom was the air he breathed, not a distant dream to be whispered in fear. It is crucial to understand that his roots were deep, connecting him back to the great civilizations of Africa, where mathematics, astronomy, and theology were studied, while Europe was still finding its way. He was born into a legacy of resistance, surrounded by men and women who preferred the dangers of the jaguar-filled jungle to the safety of chains. This was a society that functioned with its own laws and hierarchy, a slap in the face to the colonial powers that claimed Africans were incapable of self-governance. In this cradle of liberty, the young boy absorbed the spirit of the warrior, learning that dignity is not given by a master, but claimed by the strength of one's own hand. The Portuguese Empire looked at Palmares and saw a threat that had to be extinguished, unaware that they were about to ignite a fire that would burn for centuries. Tragedy struck swiftly when the boy was approximately 6 years old, as a brutal Portuguese raid tore him away from his family and the sanctuary of the palm forests. He was captured not to be killed, but to be molded, and was given to a Catholic priest named Father Antonio Milo to be raised within the confines of the colony. They renamed him Francisco, attempting to wash away his identity with holy water and replace his African heritage with Latin prayers and the Portuguese language. He proved to be a prodigy, mastering the languages and the theology of his captors, Yet his heart remained wild and tethered to the rhythm of the drums he could no longer hear. For years he served at the altar, a living experiment to prove that these savages could be civilized. But the colonizers failed to realize that intelligence is the enemy of oppression. He observed the cruelty of the slave society around him, watching his brothers and sisters breaking their backs in the sugar fields while he was forced to recite scripture. The education they gave him became his weapon, as he learned the strategies, the logic, and the weaknesses of the European mind that sought to enslave his people. He realized that his cage was gilded, but it was still a cage, and that the God they preached about could not possibly condone the suffering he witnessed daily. At the tender age of 15, the call of his ancestors became a roar he could no longer ignore, drowning out the Latin masses and the priest's instructions. The decision was made in the silence of the night. He would reject the name Francisco, reject the comfort of the mission, and run back to the danger of freedom. The journey back to Palmares was not merely a physical trek through the wilderness. It was a spiritual pilgrimage, shedding the layers of the colonizer with every step he took. He navigated the treacherous terrain using instincts that had laid dormant during his years of captivity, guided by the stars and the whispers of the wind. When he finally emerged from the tree line and saw the fortifications of Palmares, he was no longer the boy who was taken, but a young man reborn. His return was met with skepticism and wonder, for it was rare for anyone to escape the psychological and physical grip of the Portuguese education system and return to the tribe. He reintegrated himself into the society of Palmares, not as a superior educated man, but as a humble warrior willing to learn the ways of the jungle warfare. His knowledge of the Portuguese language and military tactics quickly made him an invaluable asset to Gunga Zumba, the great leader and his own uncle. He shed the clothes of the colony and adopted the attire of his people, allowing the sun to darken his skin and the hard labor to strengthen his body. This was the period where the legend began to take shape, a young strategist who knew how the enemy thought because he had lived inside their heads. He fought in the front lines during the skirmishes, earning the respect of the veteran soldiers not through his lineage, but through the blood he spilled for their safety. Zumbi had returned home, but he knew that as long as the Portuguese held power in the valleys below, their home would never truly be safe from destruction. Tensions rose when the Portuguese, tired of the constant defeats, offered a peace treaty to Gunga Zumba, promising freedom for those born in Palmares but demanding the return of new runaways. Gunga Zumba, weary from years of war, was inclined to accept the offer to save his people from further bloodshed, hoping for a coexistence that seemed impossible. But Zumbi, young and fierce, saw the treaty for what it was: a trap designed to divide their community and eventually dismantle the resistance from the inside out. He argued that accepting the freedom of some while condemning others to slavery was a betrayal of the very principles that Palmares was built upon. "We do not fight for the freedom of the few," he likely declared. "We fight for the end of slavery itself, for every brother and sister in chains." The disagreement led to a fracture in the leadership, and eventually, after the death of Gunga Zumba, the mantle of leadership fell upon the shoulders of Zumbi. He was now the general of a free state surrounded by enemies, a king without a crown, driven by an unyielding vision of total liberation. Under his command, the stance of Palmares shifted from defensive survival to active, aggressive resistance against the plantation system that fed the colonial economy. He knew that peace with the colonizers was a delusion, and that freedom would only be maintained through the sharpness of their spears and the strength of their walls. The era of negotiation was over. The era of Zumbi, the warrior who would become a nightmare to the Portuguese crown, had officially begun. Under Zumbi's leadership, the settlement grew into what many historians now call the Republic of Palmares, a complex society that rivaled many European towns in size and organization. It was a melting pot of cultures, housing not just escaped African slaves, but also indigenous Brazilians and marginalized whites who sought refuge from the colonial law. They cultivated corn, beans, manioc, and sugarcane, creating a self-sustaining economy that did not rely on the blood money of the transatlantic slave trade. The society was governed by a mix of African traditions and local adaptations, with Zumbi acting as a monarch who ruled with the consent of his council. Religion was fluid and syncretic, but the Islamic roots of the leaders influenced the discipline and moral code that kept the community strong against internal decay. It stood as a beacon of hope, a tangible proof that the African was not a beast of burden, but a human being capable of building a civilization. For decades, Palmares mocked the Portuguese Empire simply by existing, a constant reminder that their power was not absolute and their chains could be broken. The people of the Republic lived with the constant threat of invasion, yet they celebrated life with music, dance, and the martial art known today as capoeira. It was a utopia under siege, a fragile flower blooming in the middle of a battlefield, protected only by the will of its people and the strategy of its general. Zumbi was not just their king. He was the physical embodiment of their refusal to bow, the living spirit of the Quilombo that kept the darkness at bay. The Portuguese crown could no longer tolerate this insolence, and they hired the most ruthless mercenary of the time, Domingos Jorge Velho, to destroy Palmares once and for all. Velho brought with him an army of thousands, equipped with cannons and driven by the promise of land and the spoils of war, marching towards the sanctuary. The siege of Palmares was not a battle. It was a grinder of human flesh, lasting for weeks as the defenders rained arrows and rocks upon the invaders. Zumbi led the defense from the front lines, his presence inspiring his warriors to fight beyond the limits of exhaustion, holding back the tide of colonization. But the technological superiority of the Portuguese artillery eventually breached the wooden walls, turning the haven of freedom into a slaughterhouse of fire and blood. The fall of the main settlement was a scene of horror, with men, women, and children fighting to the death rather than returning to the shackles of slavery. Zumbi was wounded but managed to escape the carnage, retreating into the deepest parts of the jungle to continue the resistance as a guerrilla fighter. The Republic had fallen, but the king was still alive, and as long as he drew breath, the Portuguese knew that the spirit of Palmares was not dead. For almost 2 years after the fall, Zumbi haunted the colonizers like a ghost, striking from the shadows and vanishing before they could react. He became a myth, a legend that whispered through the plantations, giving hope to the enslaved that their liberator was still out there, waiting for the right moment. History teaches us the saddest lesson of all, that the strongest fortresses are not breached by cannons from without, but by betrayal from within. The Portuguese captured a trusted lieutenant of Zumbi named Antonio Soares and tortured him until his spirit broke and he agreed to lead them to his commander. It is a tragedy that echoes through time, the friend who turns into a serpent, leading the enemy to the very heart of the resistance under the guise of friendship. On November 20, 1695, Zumbi was hiding in a secluded cave, likely tending to his wounds and planning his next move, when he saw a familiar face approach. He came out to greet his friend, his guard down, only to be met with the cold steel of betrayal as the Portuguese soldiers sprang their ambush. Even in the face of certain death, Zumbi did not surrender. He fought with the ferocity of a lion, taking several soldiers down with him before he fell. He was not captured alive to be paraded in chains. He died as a free man, on his own terms, battling for the liberty of his people until the very end. The soldiers, terrified of his legend, did not treat his body with respect but mutilated it to prove to themselves that he was merely mortal. The betrayal of Antonio Soares is a scar on the history of the resistance, a reminder that the oppressor often uses the oppressed to do their dirty work. Zumbi's physical war had ended, but the war over his memory and what he stood for was only just beginning in the minds of the people. The Portuguese authorities committed a final act of barbarism to ensure that the legend of Zumbi would not inspire future generations of slaves to revolt. They severed his head and transported it to the city of Recife, where they displayed it in the public square like a macabre trophy of their victory. This was done to disprove the rumor that Zumbi was immortal, a belief that had spread among the enslaved population who saw him as a supernatural savior. They wanted to show that the King of Palmares was just flesh and bone, that he could rot like any other man, and that resistance was futile. But in doing so, they inadvertently cemented his status as a martyr, for a martyr is far more dangerous to an empire than a living soldier. The sight of their fallen leader did not bring the submission the Portuguese hoped for. Instead, it planted a seed of silent, simmering anger that would grow for centuries. The physical body of Zumbi was destroyed, but the idea of Zumbi, the idea that a black man could be a king and a free warrior, was indestructible. They tried to kill the man to kill the hope, but they failed to understand that hope is not a thing of the body, but of the spirit. November 20th became a date etched in blood and memory, a day that would eventually rise from the ashes of history to claim its rightful place. The Portuguese thought they had won, but they had merely completed the first chapter of a story that is still being written by the descendants of Palmares today. Now, we return to the mystery that started my journey. How did the name of a noble resistance leader become the word for a brainless, flesh-eating monster? Scholars debate the etymology, linking Zumbi to the Kimbundu word Nzumb, meaning a spirit or a ghost, which is a respectful term in African spirituality. However, the Western world, particularly through the lens of Haitian folklore misinterpreted by Hollywood, twisted the concept of the spirit into the undead. It is a subtle form of assassination. By taking the name of a black hero and attaching it to a monster, you strip the name of its power and dignity. When a child hears zombie today, they think of The Walking Dead or World War Z, not of the warrior who defended the Republic of Palmares against an empire. This is not an accident. It is the colonization of language, ensuring that the icons of resistance are either forgotten or turned into something to be feared. The zombie of pop culture is a body without a mind, a slave to hunger. The real Zumbi was a mind that refused to be a body for slave labor. Hollywood owes an apology to history, for they have taken a sacred memory and desecrated it for the sake of box office sales and cheap thrills. We must reclaim the word. When we say Zumbi, we should think of courage, strategy, and the unquenchable desire for freedom that defines the human spirit. The monster is not the one who rose from the dead. The monster is the system that tries to bury the truth about those who fought for justice. Today, in the vast and colorful land of Brazil, the spirit of Zumbi dos Palmares is not dead, nor is it undead. It is vibrantly alive. Every year on November 20th, the country celebrates Black Consciousness Day, a national holiday dedicated to reflecting on the contributions and struggles of Afro-Brazilians. Statues of Zumbi now stand in public squares where slave markets used to be, watching over the descendants of the people he fought to save. He is taught in schools not as a rebel criminal, as the Portuguese claimed, but as a national hero who championed the values of liberty and equality. The capoeira circles that spin in the streets of Rio and Bahia sing songs that mention his name, keeping his memory alive through rhythm and movement. His life is a testament to the fact that you can kill a revolutionary, but you cannot kill the revolution if it is rooted in the hearts of the people. Zumbi reminds us that freedom is not a gift from the powerful. It is a constant struggle, a garden that must be watered with vigilance and courage. He stands as a bridge between Africa and the Americas, a symbol of the resilience of the diaspora that survived the Middle Passage and thrived against all odds. The real Zumbi was a father, a strategist, a king, and a Muslim who bowed only to God, never to the whip of a master. As I prepare to leave this timeline, I look at the statue of Zumbi, and I do not see a zombie. I see the most alive man in history. I close the book of World War Z and leave it on the shelf of history, for I have found a story far more compelling and real. The story of Zumbi dos Palmares is a mirror for humanity, forcing us to ask ourselves who the real monsters are in our history books. Are they the ones who fight for their freedom with makeshift weapons? Or are they the ones who build empires on the backs of stolen human beings? We must be careful with the words we consume and the movies we watch, for entertainment is often the most effective way to rewrite the past. I leave 17th century Brazil with a heavy heart but a clear mind, knowing that the truth, no matter how deep it is buried, will always find a way to the surface. The legacy of Zumbi is not fear, but the relentless, undying pulse of liberty that beats in the chest of every person who refuses to be oppressed. He teaches us that even if they cut off your head, they cannot cut off your ideas, and that is a power that no weapon can ever destroy. So the next time you hear the word zombie, do not think of the walking dead. Think of the marching living, the warriors of Palmares. History is not what is written by the victors. History is what is remembered by the survivors, and Zumbi survives in every cry for justice today. I am Mega Alpha Tech, witnessing the timelines of your planet, reminding you that your history is richer and more complex than any fiction you could invent. If this journey through time has opened your eyes to a truth hidden in plain sight, please subscribe and ring the bell to join our expedition into the mysteries of history. Do not forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments, for every interaction helps us defeat the algorithm that prefers mindless entertainment over deep truth. Share this video with someone who needs to know the real story behind the name, because sharing knowledge is the ultimate act of resistance against ignorance.